in the radiant halls of Versailles, where every movement was rehearsed like a divine ritual, a child walked as if he did not belong. Philippe of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, was born amid the music of harpsichords and the scent of lavender. Yet his eyes were always distant, as though they searched for something that the golden walls could never offer. Servants whispered that he was too silent, too still, too aware of things no child should feel. While other boys laughed in the gardens, Philippe followed his mother, Marie Anne of Bavaria, like a shadow that could not stand the light. She was his refuge in a palace made of mirrors, the only presence that anchored him to this world. When she died in 1690, Philippe was only 6 years old. The palace fell quiet for a moment, and in that silence something inside him broke. They found him standing by her lifeless body for a full day, refusing food, refusing water, his small hands trembling as if trying to hold on to what had already slipped away. No tears came, no cry was heard. That night, the child they knew vanished. What remained was a figure moving through Versailles, like a ghost who had forgotten where it died. The courtiers called it melancholy, the familiar sickness of royal blood. But it was more than that. It was the seed of a darkness that would one day grow into madness, the kind that feeds on silence and turns love into chains. In the heart of the most dazzling court in Europe, a boy had already begun to unravel, and the crown that waited for him would only tighten the knot. If you believe that even kings can be haunted by their own ghosts, subscribe to our channel, where history speaks in whispers too heavy to fade. The year was 1700, when King Charles II of Spain died without a child to inherit his empire. The Habsburg bloodline ended in silence, leaving Europe trembling between ambition and fear. The vast Spanish realm stretched from the New World to the Pacific, and its vacant throne became the greatest prize of the century. From his palace in France, Louis XIV chose his grandson, Philippe of Anjou, a quiet boy of 17, to claim the Spanish crown. The news reached Versailles like a victory hymn, yet inside the boy's heart, it sounded like a dirge. Philippe had never known confidence or joy. Now he was to carry the weight of an empire already crumbling under its own gold. When he left France, the court cheered, but his eyes stayed lowered. Those who escorted him across the Pyrenees spoke of his silence, of the way he stared at the mountains as though they were walls closing in. When he arrived in Madrid, the crowd filled the streets, shouting blessings to welcome their new king. But what they saw was a pale and trembling figure whose crown seemed too heavy for his head. His voice barely carried across the hall of his coronation, and even the echo seemed reluctant to return. The court of Spain, worn by the decline of the Habsburgs, had hoped for strength. Instead, it received fragility wrapped in velvet and fear. The French advisors who accompanied Philippe knew he would not endure alone. They proposed a marriage to steady his mind and to comfort his heart. The chosen bride was Maria Luisa of Savoy, only 13, soft-spoken, yet wise beyond her years. Her arrival in Madrid was met with relief. Her beauty and gentleness brought a fleeting warmth to the cold corridors of the Escorial. Their wedding was celebrated with parades and prayer, and for a moment, the kingdom believed it had been blessed. But within the intimacy of the royal chambers, the truth emerged. Philippe refused to let her leave his side. She became the air he breathed, the light he could not bear to lose. Ministers waited in antechambers for hours while the king whispered to her in secret. When she stepped away, he grew pale, his breath shallow, as if part of his soul had left the room with her. Maria Luisa endured it with grace, unaware that her compassion was feeding his dependence. Her days were spent by his side, soothing his fears, listening to his endless murmurs about death, faith, and betrayal. The young queen learned quickly that she had not married a man, but the echo of his sorrow. The palace changed with them. Curtains stayed drawn, voices softened, music faded. The courtiers moved like phantoms through halls that smelled of candle wax and fear. The grandeur of Versailles had been replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the sound of time itself. In that silence, love began to rot. What had been affection turned into chains of obsession, and within those chains, the first cracks of madness began to show, thin and quiet, like veins spreading through marble, ready to shatter the crown that bound them both. The years that followed weighed heavily upon the palace walls. Maria Luisa of Savoy had arrived as a girl full of light, but that light dimmed with every sleepless night spent beside her husband. Philippe's mind, restless and frightened, demanded her presence in every moment. When he woke screaming from the visions that haunted his dreams, she was there to quiet him. When he refused to eat, she coaxed him with her own trembling hands. Her voice became the fragile bridge between his madness and the world outside their chamber. The court watched her decline in silence. Her smile became faint. Her skin turned pale, and her eyes, once clear and bright, carried the weight of endless fatigue. The physicians prescribed rest, yet Philippe could not bear her absence. Even in illness, she was never allowed to close her eyes for long. He would sit beside her bed, clutching her wrist as though measuring the pulse of his own existence. When she tried to sleep, he whispered her name until she opened her eyes again. It was not love that bound them now, but terror. He believed that if she slept too deeply, she would vanish, and with her would go the last thread holding his sanity. Despite her frailty, Maria Luisa fulfilled every royal duty expected of her. Between the years 1707 and 1714, she gave birth to 4 sons. Each birth weakened her body further. Yet even in the agony of labor, Philippe refused to leave the room. He paced like a captive animal, trembling at every cry, unable to comprehend that the pain bringing new life was not the same pain that had already begun to kill her. The queen's health deteriorated as the seasons turned. She lost weight. Her hair thinned. Her voice grew softer until it was almost a whisper. She hid her exhaustion behind calm smiles, attending ceremonies and greeting ambassadors as though nothing was wrong. Only her ladies-in-waiting knew how she wept in private, how she dreaded the nights when the king's nightmares would return. Every evening felt like a descent into a world where the walls whispered and the candles burned too slowly. In February of 1714, her strength failed at last. Fever consumed her, and her frail body could no longer bear the toll. When the physicians realized there was no hope, they asked the king to leave her chamber. He refused. Philippe sat at her side, holding her hand as her breath slowed, calling her name again and again, as though his voice could bind her to life. Witnesses later said that when her chest stilled, he did not cry. He simply stared at her face, waiting for it to move, waiting for the ghost of a breath to return. For 3 days, he remained by her side, unmoving. He spoke to her as if she still lived, answering his own questions in her soft voice, laughing and weeping in turns. The servants were too afraid to intervene until the smell of death filled the room. When they finally entered, Philippe screamed and tore his clothes, shouting that they were burying his soul along with his queen. The court dared not speak. Outside the palace gates, the bells of Madrid tolled for the young queen, but inside, the kingdom had already lost its king. What remained on the throne was not a ruler, but a hollow vessel, a man possessed by grief so deep it had erased the line between the living and the dead. The death of Maria Luisa left the Spanish court adrift. Ministers moved through the palace like mourners in a mausoleum, unsure whom to serve. The king no longer governed, and his silence frightened even the most loyal among them. In France, Louis XIV understood that if nothing was done, the Bourbon crown he had fought to secure would crumble into dust. He decided that Philippe must marry again, not for love or alliance, but to restore a semblance of order. The search for a queen was brief. Across the Italian states, one name stood out. Elisabeth Farnese of Parma was known for her education, her will, and her composure. She was not soft like the girl who came before her. She had been raised among scheming courtiers and understood power as both a weapon and a shield. When she accepted the proposal, she was told she would be marrying a man weakened by grief. No one warned her she was walking into the kingdom of madness. Her arrival in Madrid was quiet. The city had grown used to mourning, and the palace still carried the faint scent of incense from the last funeral. When Elisabeth was led to the royal chambers, Philippe waited for her in silence. In his hands were a box of jewels and folded gowns once worn by his dead wife. His voice was soft, almost tender, as he told her she would wear them, so that Maria Luisa could return. For a moment she did not move. She saw at once that this was not a marriage, but an inheritance of ghosts. Elisabeth obeyed. She dressed in the silks of another woman, placed the jewels upon her neck, and entered the life of a stranger. The courtiers whispered that the new queen was playing a role written by the dead. Yet within her, a plan began to form. She saw how the king clung to illusion, how his mind flickered like a candle that refused to die. And she understood that the only way to survive was to guide that flame rather than fight it. Where Maria Luisa had yielded, Elisabeth observed. She watched the rhythm of his moods, learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to hold his hand and when to let him wander through his delusions. With careful patience, she became both his comfort and his keeper. Gradually, she took control of the council meetings, signing decrees in his name, whispering advice that shaped the kingdom. The ministers, at first hesitant, began to look to her for direction. Spain began to move again, though its king remained lost within his mind. The palace adapted to its new rhythm. The days passed in whispers, the nights in restraint. Philippe drifted through the halls like a shadow wrapped in royal robes, murmuring to people no one could see. And behind him walked Elisabeth, calm and composed, holding the threads of power that slipped through his trembling fingers. Under her quiet command, the kingdom began to breathe again. Roads were repaired, treaties renewed, armies reorganized. Yet in the heart of the palace, nothing truly changed. The same silence lingered, the same unease haunted every chamber. Spain now had a queen who could rule, but she did so beside a man who no longer knew what it meant to be alive. The court bowed before them, uncertain which of the two truly held the crown. As the years passed, the grandeur of the Bourbon court withered into decay. Power no longer shone through the palace, but clung to its walls like the dampness of sickness. Philippe's body began to fail as completely as his mind. He developed a fear of water so intense that he refused to wash. His attendants could no longer persuade him to change his clothes. The same garments clung to him until they reeked of sweat and rot. Servants sprinkled perfume and burned incense, but nothing could disguise the smell that settled over the royal chambers. Elisabeth endured it all in silence. Her letters to her family in Parma spoke of nights that never ended, of whispers that circled the room long after the king had fallen into his broken sleep. She wrote that she was living beside a man who was already dead, but had not yet been buried. Yet she never left him. To abandon Philippe would be to abandon her power and the fragile balance that kept the kingdom from collapsing. So she stayed, carrying her crown like a cross. Her every breath mingled with the scent of decay. By the winter of 1724, the king's strength faded further. His mind turned inward until even the act of ruling became unbearable. He spoke of sin, of unworthiness, of his fear that his very existence was corrupting the throne. Then one morning, without warning, he announced his abdication. He placed the crown upon the head of his eldest son, Louis, and declared that he would retire to a life of prayer. The court was stunned, but none dared oppose him. For the first time in decades, Spain dared to hope for calm. Philippe and Elisabeth withdrew to La Granja, a quiet palace of gardens and fountains built to imitate Versailles. But even surrounded by beauty, his mind found no peace. He prayed through the nights, speaking to saints only he could see, weeping before unseen altars, demanding that Elisabeth kneel beside him until her knees bled upon the stone. The courtiers called it devotion, but she knew it was madness wearing the mask of faith. Then, in the summer of that same year, tragedy returned. King Louis, only 17, fell ill with smallpox. The disease tore through his body with cruel speed. When the news of his death reached La Granja, the courtiers held their breath, expecting grief. Instead, Philippe laughed. He said it was a sign from God, that the crown was calling him back, that heaven itself had confirmed his destiny. Within weeks, he returned to Madrid. The city gathered to see its king again. But what they saw was not the man who had once ascended the throne. He arrived pale and gaunt, his beard wild, his eyes hollow and wandering. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his voice soft and uncertain, like an echo trapped in stone. The courtiers knelt in dread rather than reverence. Spain understood that their ruler had returned, but his soul had not followed. The figure who now sat upon the throne was little more than the shadow of the boy once crowned in glory. The power he carried no longer belonged to a living man, but to a ghost that refused to rest. The kingdom bowed, not to strength, but to the haunting persistence of madness disguised as divine right. When Felipe returned to Madrid, the court welcomed a body without a mind. The palace, once bright with ceremony, now stood wrapped in stillness. He spoke little, his voice reduced to murmurs that no one could understand. Curtains were kept closed, candles burned through the day, and the air grew heavy with incense to mask the scent of a ruler who no longer belonged to the living. Elisabeth no longer tried to save him. Her patience had turned into discipline, her sorrow into purpose. She ruled with precision, keeping the illusion of monarchy alive while her husband drifted between prayers and hallucinations. Courtiers avoided looking directly at the king. They bowed to the floor rather than his face, fearing the emptiness that stared back. Each evening began with the same ritual. A man from Italy, the great singer Farinelli, entered the darkened hall. When his voice rose, the atmosphere changed. The notes flowed like light over the marble floors, touching the walls, the chandeliers, the sleeping conscience of the court. The king would sit motionless, his trembling hands quiet for the first time in years. For a brief moment, the madness paused. Philippe listened as if the music came from somewhere beyond human reach. When the last note faded, he whispered words of gratitude, believing the sound had been sent from heaven. The next night, he demanded it again and again. The song became his prayer, the only rhythm left in a world stripped of meaning. Elisabeth watched from a distance, her face unreadable. The voice that calmed the king was also her escape. It allowed her to rule undisturbed, to preserve the kingdom, while the man beside her surrendered completely to illusion. Ministers learned to time their affairs around the music. The entire court moved according to the breath of a single aria. The years passed inside that fragile harmony. Spain continued to live, though its ruler existed only in echo and ritual. The people outside the palace spoke of miracles, unaware that the miracle was only survival. And so the songs continued, filling the void where a king's heart should have been, carrying the kingdom through silence, one note at a time. In the summer of 1746, the long reign of Philippe V finally ended. He was 62 years old, his body frail, his mind drifting between prayer and delirium. For days he lay in his darkened chamber, his breathing uneven, his hands twitching against the sheets. He spoke to people who were no longer there, calling softly for his mother, whispering the name of Maria Luisa, as though she might return to lead him out of the shadows. Elisabeth sat beside him, her face calm, her eyes hollow from decades without rest. She held his hand until it went cold, unsure if what she felt was mercy or exhaustion. When the bells of Madrid announced his death, the city did not mourn in the way it once would have. The news spread quietly, and the sound that followed was not grief, but release. Windows were opened for the first time in years, curtains drawn back to let the sun fall upon walls that had forgotten its warmth. The palace smelled of smoke and wax and age. The servants moved carefully through its corridors, as if afraid that the silence itself might shatter. His son Ferdinand, now king, ordered the royal chambers cleansed. The heavy drapes were burned, the carpets replaced, the furniture polished until no trace of the old reign remained. It was not rebellion, but exorcism. He wanted to rid the kingdom of the scent that had lingered too long, the scent of fear and madness that had soaked into the stone. Madrid began to breathe again, its courtyards filled with light. Its people walked with freer steps. Its songs returned to the streets. Elisabeth withdrew from court life and retired to La Granja, the palace that had once been her prison. There she lived another 20 years, a queen without a kingdom, surrounded by gardens that bloomed in indifferent beauty. She spent her mornings in prayer and her nights in silence. Those who visited her spoke of a woman at peace, yet her letters told a different story. In one of them she wrote that she had already died once, within the madness of the man she had served. Everything that came after was merely survival. History would remember Philippe as the first Bourbon king of Spain. But the truth was quieter. His rule was a mirror of the human mind when burdened with absolute power. Behind the grandeur of palaces and treaties, there was only a man who never escaped the ghosts of his childhood. His crown did not lift him above suffering. It only magnified it until the kingdom itself became a reflection of his decay. He proved that a man can wear a crown and still be ruled by his ghosts. And in the end, it was not Spain that went mad, but the belief that a crown could ever save a broken soul. If you believe power often hides its own decay, subscribe to our channel, where history breathes through the silence of its ruins.